Numerous spooky archetypes exist in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game, vampire, ghost trick, Vendread, and so on. These archetypes are exclusively composed of zombie monsters, making them among the most common types in the game. One of the earliest and weakest zombie-type monsters, Skull Servant, gained support from the Lost Millennium Booster Pack in June 2005. King of the Skull Servants turned this joke monster into a power source that made it relevant enough to play. Back then, it was possible to boost King of the Skull Servants to 5,000 ATK, 3 copies of Skull Servant, and 2 other kings in the graveyard. Nearly 20 years later, this concept evolved into an entire archetype in its own right. Wight. Their main strategy is to flood their graveyard with Skull Servants and Wight monsters to boost King of the Skull Servants' ATK to astronomical levels. Fittingly, many Wight monsters have effects to mill other monsters in their archetype and speed up the deck's winning condition. They're all low-leveled monsters in their own right, so they can also be used in massive extra deck flooding plays. 10. Skull Servant, a fusion material for Zombie Warrior. Zombie Warrior is only considered a Skull Servant card because it uses the namesake monster as a fusion material. Outside of being an instant fusion and/or ready fusion option, this should never so much as hit the board. Since Skull Servant is a fusion material, several cards can interact with it by revealing this card from the extra deck. One currently OCG-only card, Overload Future Fusion, is a continuous spell that can reveal this card to mill a Skull Servant if the controller can't do much else. 9. The Original Skull Servant, perfect for discard fodder. The original Skull Servant doesn't do anything to speed up a Wight player's winning condition on its own, yet having 3 copies of it is deemed mandatory. Since the likelihood of drawing a Skull Servant is fairly common, it's wise to have cards that can discard it to fuel their effects. Allure of Darkness can banish this from the controller's hand since it's fairly easy to return a banished Skull Servant to the graveyard. 8. Tri-Wight, setting up a large extra deck monster. Tri-Wight, in particular, is one of those ways. It can revive all 3 copies of the original Skull Servant at no cost or conditions. This card can facilitate numerous extra deck plays, like a rank 1 XYZ monster or a link 3 monster. It should be pointed out that Tri-Wight is only a Wight card by name and doesn't directly support the archetype itself. Even so, this card is an incentive to run 3 copies of Skull Servant. 7. The Lady in Wight, protecting the king from spells and traps. The Lady in Wight does little on its own, but its presence protects every other low-leveled zombie monster from being destroyed by battle or being affected by spells and traps, including the King of the Skull Servants. Since it specifically disallows the Lady in Wights from getting this protection, having 2 or more copies on the board doesn't allow them to protect each other. It's treated as a Skull Servant in the graveyard, so it's still helpful off the board. 6. Wight Mare, recycling banished Skull Servants and Wights. Wight Mare is simple. Discard it to return a banished Skull Servant or Wight Mare to the graveyard or put a banished Lady in Wight or King of the Skull Servants on the board. Like the other Wights, it's a Skull Servant in the graveyard. More importantly, this card never has to be summoned to be useful. It would have been much better if it were a quick effect, fetching a banished Lady in Wight in response to an opponent's field wiping spell or trap would have been incredible. 5. Wight Prince, setting up the graveyard and calling the king. Wight Prince should always be run at 3 copies for any Wight deck. It freely mills a Skull Servant and the Lady of Wight if it hits the graveyard, no matter the circumstances. It can also banish itself and 2 other Skull Servants to summon the king from the deck. Considering Wight Mare's function, this isn't as much of a drawback as it seems. Like the other Wights, it's a Skull Servant in the graveyard. 4. Wight Lord, new milling options for Wights. Like Wight Mare, Wight Lord doesn't need to be summoned to be useful. The newest Wight in the archetype lets the owner mill from their deck, Lightsworn style, based on the number of Skull Servants in the graveyard. It can also banish itself to revive any Skull Servant, including a king, from the graveyard, even one of the copies it just milled. Like the other Wights, it's a Skull Servant in the graveyard. 3. Wight Princess, milling the prince who mills 2 more Wights. While Wight Prince is the card that puts a Skull Servant and the Lady of Wight in the graveyard by going there itself, Wight Princess is the card that puts Wight Prince in the graveyard by being summoned. This chain mills 3 Wights with a single card, plus it has a decent 1600 ATK to safely normal summon with. If that isn't enough, this card can also send itself from the hand or board to weaken every other monster's ATK and def by 300 times its level or rank. 2. Wight Baking, protecting other zombies and searching Wights. Wight Baking is what the Lady of Wight wishes it was. It can protect other low-leveled zombie monsters from being destroyed by discarding itself. More importantly, this card is the first real searcher in a Wight deck if it hits the graveyard, even if it was discarded by its own effect. It adds 2 other Wight monsters from the deck to the hand, then lets the player discard one of them. Like the other Wights, it's a Skull Servant in the graveyard. 1. The King of the Skull Servants, reaching a staggering 23,000 ATK. The King of the Skull Servants is the boss monster for any Wight deck. It gains 1,000 ATK for each Skull Servant and King in the graveyard. This effect alone can boost it to 23,000 ATK. 3 copies of Skull Servant, and each Wight plus the other 2 kings in the graveyard equals 23 cards. It can also banish another Skull Servant or king from the graveyard to bring itself back if it's destroyed in battle.